You're muted.
Thank you. Of course, it had to happen. I'm muted. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining wherever you are around the world, for joining the first public briefing organized by the Content Policy and Society Lab, a new project initiative by the Program on Democracy and the Internet at Stanford University. So today we're extremely pleased to welcome you to this public briefing where we will focus on the issue of content and conflict, and particularly talk about the case of Ethiopia. As a reminder, for those who don't know the Content Policy and Society Lab, this is a new project that will prototype, explore how to use multi-stakeholderism to build, design content policies, rules that regulate what we're allowed to say online or not on platforms in general, design rules that are strongly embedded in human rights principles and that are operationable and actionable. So it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you here today. I will pass it to my colleague, Nusha Roshani, the Deputy Director of the Content Policy and Society Lab, to introduce the speaker. But before we do that, just a rapid housekeeping, if you allow me. This discussion will last 1 hour. We'll start with a discussion with the panelists, who will be introduced in a few seconds. The discussion will last 40 minutes, and then we'll leave it a bit of time for questions from the audience. So please don't hesitate to type your questions in the feature available. Nusha, I'm passing it on to you.
Thank you very much, Julie, and hello to everyone. We have the honor today to be joined by fantastic speakers, and to start with Nelson Kwaje, who is a South Sudanese tech and digital rights advocate, who has worked in Kenya, Ethiopia, Sudan, South Sudan, Uganda, and Cameroon. Nelson's work on 211check.org has been instrumental in combating hate speech and misinformation relating to the COVID-19 pandemic in South Sudan. He currently chairs the board of Defy Hate Now in South Sudan. Followed by Azeb Madebo, who is a digital media scholar, cultural studies scholar, ethnographer, and Ethiopianist. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Southern California in journalism and communication. She's interested in the appropriation and adaptation of communication technologies by Africans for sociopolitical ends like the politics of identity, racial and ethnic in the Eastern African diaspora. We'll also have Robera Haile Hamda, who is a lawyer and former DLA Piper Global Scholarship Fellow. He currently is a legal advisor, risk and media and analysis consultant for private companies, including Fortune 500 companies and international organizations via a network of experts. Last but not least, we'll have Johannes Enu Ayelu, who is a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Law at Monash University and was formerly a lecturer in media law and human rights at Bahir Dar University in Ethiopia. His project is looking at balancing the rights to freedom of expression and to privacy on the internet under the African human rights system. We like to start with some of the questions, but also addressing the question to all of you. For many of us who are not aware of the context, can you please give us a brief overview of the conflict in Ethiopia since the death of Hachalu Hundessa and how it unfolded online as well? So I would like to ask you to just keep it to, brief to a 3-minute explanation. So maybe starting with Johannes.
Thank you very much, Nusha. To begin with, the Ethiopian conflict problem has structural roots. Basically, it started in 1960s when the student movement was started. After that, we have an ethnic form of federalism since 1995, and the ethnic form of federalism enabled regional states for self-governance. At the same time, ethnicity has become, the frame for governance throughout the country, and that enabled for hate speech and division across the country, especially in 2016 and 18. There was a massive protest across the country by Oromo users and Amhara users, and that helped change the countries into democratization. But that change as well have some sort of, challenge after 2018, after the assassination of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, and there was a massive legal and political changes ensued in the country, and followed by unrest across the country, especially since June 2020. There was also a protest in Oromia that after the killing of a famous Oromo singer named Hachalu Hundessa, and after his assassination, there was ethnic-based attack and also hate speech, according to the report of Ethiopian Human Rights Commission that was published in 2020. Content that were circulated in the social media helped or abated, crime against humanity, against, ethnic minorities living there and beyond. And followed by, there was a kind of election postponement due to COVID pandemic, and that election postponement, created a kind of constitutional conundrum across the country, and that creates a rift between the Tigrayan People Liberation Front and the federal government, and followed by the House of Federation cuts budgets for the Tigray region, and that was the friction. And in November the 3rd, in the midnight of the November 3rd, 2020, the northern command of the Ethiopian Defense Forces was attacked by the Tigrayan People Liberation Front, according to the recent joint report of the UN Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission found that the TPLF was responsible for the attack against the northern command, and that was, the cause for the outbreak of this war. And followed by the Ethiopian federal government launched an offensive against the Tigrayan People Liberation Front, and followed by, massive allegations of war crimes and crime against humanity, according to the same joint report of UN and Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. There were serious violation of human rights, which may amount to war crime and crime against humanity. I would stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johannes. Oh, sorry, Julie, please go ahead. Oh, I was just going to ask, if you could please share with us the brief overview.
I feel like Johannes went over everything. But one of the things that I would want to place emphasis on is, so following the violence that happened after Hachalu's assassination, there was a lot of misinformation that was spread on Twitter, on Facebook, which led to ethnic-based massacres of minority people within Oromia, but as well as the killing of protesters by the state or by the police within Oromia. So hundreds of people died in that short period of time, and this government implemented like a network shutdown to prevent violence. But part of the core problem that Ethiopians are kind of debating right now is the ethnic federal system that was put in place in the 1990s by the TPLF. So the TPLF being the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. So the TPLF divided Ethiopia into ethnic states after negotiations with the Oromo Liberation Front, kind of claiming that ethnic federalism was the only way to keep the country from disintegrating, as well as the only way to ensure that Ethiopia's diverse ethnic populations would be able to self-govern, use their own languages to administer their regions, as well as have more equality. So this is part of like the debate, the underlying issue that the country's dealing with. However, like the implementation of ethnic federalism has meant that ethnic parties rather than civic parties dominate the Ethiopian political space. It's also meant that ethnic minorities, those living outside of their designated ethnic states, are essentially not able to get political representation. Many Ethiopians with multi-ethnic backgrounds, so people that are mixed, also are forced to usually pick an identity, usually their father's identity, on ethnic identification cards. These are the cards that have been used to target civilians during these ethnic-based massacres. So this is part of the core issue, and and part of the core issue is who gets to decide where the future of the country is going, right? Are we going to maintain ethnic federalism and this mode of governance? Are we going to move away from this? And if so, how do we move away from this? So that's kind of where, that's the significance of ethnicity in the current conflict. And I think last week, the TPLF and OLA announced like their what do you call it? Their plans to replace the current government, right, with a new coalition party. So thinking about like, you know, like which group gets to be in power, which group gets to kind of determine, you know, the next few years or the direction that the country is going in. Yeah, so it's a really like a contestation over power, and between people or groups that want to maintain the ethnic federal model, and then the people that might find it kind of problematic or might be willing to change it. So that's the only thing I would add.
Roberta, do you want to add to that? And then Nelson, and then we'll move on to the next question. Please keep your remarks short if possible.
Thank you everyone for joining. I just want to say that with regard to this, generally, for those who are not familiar with Ethiopian context, Ethiopia have more than 80 ethnic groups. So the politics in the current federal structure of Ethiopia is based on ethnic lines. So so just after the days of Hachalu Hundessa in June 29, 2020, thousands of Oromo went to the street, and this have led to the Oromos to protest, and there was the violence have related to this. So at this time on June 2020 and in its aftermath, there was the platforms, social media platforms and other traditional medias have been extensively covering the incident, and there were medias or activists that were using hateful and violent statements to encourage people to take action about the incident, to react to that. So with regard to that, generally in Ethiopia, the Facebook, Twitter, Telegram, YouTube, TikTok, everything is being used, you know, in the current Ethiopian political context, and as a political, they use it as a medium of communication and also organizing protests and different political activities. That's one I want to ask. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Nelson?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. I don't think I'll dive deep into a lot of the discussions on Ethiopian context, because people have already done it. I'll just speak about like how that manifests in terms of social media discourse and online. One of the things that we have noticed across the region in all the countries that I've worked in, there are like lines on the sand in terms of division, whether these are ethnic, regional, and what. This exists in countries, but when situations of conflict come, these lines become harder, and the schism between different societal groups kind of grows. And in Ethiopia, more than any other place, this schism manifests, and these divisions manifest mostly during conflict. And I have been running a project during before the conflict started last year, and the conflict kind of started mid-project. I was doing a project on content moderation. And the way I've seen these divisions manifesting is that like the divisions between groups widen, and people pick more harder lines, even in terms of the language that is being used online. And I've seen a lot of people being forced to align with one ideology or another. So should you say TPLF or TDF? Should you say the junta, or you should say what? So even online, as soon as someone starts tweeting or engaging in a discourse, you by engaging, even in the use of the language that you engage, you are already perceived to have chosen a side or being pushed to choose a side. And now from that end, now also manifests on how telecommunication works in Ethiopia. For the longest time, Ethiopia operated with one telecommunication company. And the government has always used the shutdown of the internet as a way of suppressing any issues. I've seen this happening in the Benishangul Gumuz region, where I was there and there was a conflict. The government shut the internet for like few months. The government shut the internet also when there were protests. The government shut the internet when there were exams, for all kind of reasons. So this attempts to monopolize the voice doesn't, like shutting down the internet doesn't last for long. So one of the things that we have seen also manifesting as the conflict started in like 3 other ways. One of the ways is in hijacking discussions. That means each group creates a hashtag and wants to drive discussions around that, or create a theme, wants to drive the discussion around that. And if you flood the online space enough, you can move the discussion towards a certain area. The second thing is in terms of diluting the discussions. That means if there is a discourse that is happening, a group intentionally injects a certain messaging into it so that the discussion is moved so that the discussion is diluted so that no one can hear or understand a certain thing. These are things that I've seen happening within the Ethiopian ecosystem, especially online, happens from both sides. And whenever someone puts a discourse, and that is kind of attacked. The third thing is on the idea of suppressing dissent online. It usually doesn't, it is not very, it's not very obvious, but a lot of people who kind of express their views publicly and consistently, they either tend to be flooded by bots or threats or intimidations. And that usually tends to have the effect of that people can kind of either withdraw from the discussions or become so defensive until they forget what they wanted to do. And all these elements, that is what I consider to have elements that deteriorate the health of public discourse. And conflict is the biggest driver to this, but once there is a situation of conflict, more of this is seen. I think I'll talk later on more specifics.
Thank you very much, Nelson, for walking us through also the way that the conflict has been happening online too, through several technical capabilities. Before I go on to the next question, I would just like to remind participants that there is a Q&A feature available right next to the raise hand feature. Please do not hesitate to type in your questions there, and we'll make sure to ask them to the panelists. So actually, Nelson, you've just walked us through the online aspect, and particularly the main findings from the work you've been doing in the country for the past 3 years. I'll probably pass it on to Nusha for the next question.
Thank you very much, Julie. So I wanted to discuss with Azeb, considering the importance Ethiopian diaspora, and you've studied, how Ethiopians abroad interacted with the conflict, especially with difficult access to telecommunication in some conflict-affected regions, with different ethnicities underlying the conflict. Could you just share with us some of your main findings? Azeb, you're on mute.
All right. So I started looking at digital media engagement right after the assassination of Hachalu Hundessa, because I noticed that people on Instagram were having some very interesting and very difficult conversations around why the assassination happened, around the ethnic-based violence that happened soon after his assassination, and what that meant. So I interviewed people after that to ask them about, like, how did you decide to get involved in these conversations? What platforms were you using? Why were you using different platforms in different ways? And so some of the interesting findings that I did that did surface during my work involves people deciding to use WhatsApp or Telegram or private messaging services, encrypted services for organizing work, and then how that would maybe transfer onto Instagram campaigns, right? Infographics, or how they would decide to host conversations on Clubhouse. Clubhouse being, I think, a bit more divisive, right? So a lot of people left with expressed having very negative feelings after engaging on Clubhouse, feeling very depressed, angry, or frustrated frustrated after observing some of the conversations because of platform and the way that these conversations are controlled by moderators. So similar to what Nelson was saying, people that are moderators will control the conversation, control the dialogue in the direction that fits their interests, and as well as how people would try to amplify their campaigns or messages on Twitter. So how they negotiated using specific hashtags, right? And so often it would be like a response to each other. So because these campaigns are competing with each other, so there will be sometimes responding to each other, or playing onto like responding to particular hashtags or movements. I did not look into Facebook, but again, people in my interviews did indicate that they use Facebook to engage to engage in these protests, or especially to engage with people that were still in Ethiopia. So to collectivize and work alongside with Ethiopians that are still in Ethiopia for their organizing work. And I also, like what I noticed early on in June of 2020 was the conversations around ethnicity, ethnic politics, land, who owns what land, right? Who has access to what land in Ethiopia? What does it mean to be indigenous? And a lot of youth started talking also about like Ethiopian history. And this is something that I'd never seen before, right? And a lot of the people that I interviewed had not seen this before either, because this is not how they use these spaces. So they educated each other in these spaces. They shared resources. They made lists, right? Academic texts, lists of academic texts, historical texts. They created infographics to spread amongst each other, but also to kind of educate international audiences, activists, for different like campaigns, right? Like maybe like Armenians, or like other groups that have gone through similar ethnic-based conflicts, to kind of amplify the situation that was unfolding within Ethiopia. One of the interesting findings that I do have, that I think is also in line with Nelson's findings, is that a lot of youth found themselves becoming ethnic through this conflict in these digital spaces. A lot of people did not identify with ethnicity, right? Like maybe they knew that their parents had an ethnic identity or set of ethnic identities, but engaging in online politics itself, and being forced to identify, right? Because there were very hard lines drawn very quickly after the assassination of Haj Alu, but also after the war in Ethiopia started in November. In November of 2020, like activist campaigns automatically kind of associated some groups as the enemies, right, as competitors, some groups as the villains or victims. So people were forced to participate in these discourses already kind of positioned as either victim or villain, as perpetrator, or, as indigenous, or, settler, or something like that. So for a lot of youth, this was very shocking. It was very depressing. And so they had a very difficult time figuring out how to engage in these spaces without ethnicizing themselves, or without essentializing themselves or these politics. So I think this falls in line with some of the findings that Nelson was talking about. So in some of the ways, the tactics that this happened through, because there are no like physical boundaries, like we are living amongst each other in the United States, right? Like our neighbors are from these different ethnic groups. We don't know what each other are. People started using iconographies, images, profile images, like emojis in their bios. So things that were not really highly contested, like having an emoji of a tree or a flag, like the Ethiopian flag, or like the yellow and red pill, became very significant, right? So they started to signify ethnic identity. And so I kind of observed like the transitions and how these different iconographies became adapted over time. And so there was some negotiations around which iconographies would be adapted, which ones would be representative of particular groups. So this unfolded within that year and a half of this conflict. So and because of these iconographies, you were able to identify the ethnic groups or the ideologies of different people that they might not have been able to beforehand, right? And so this automatically kind of structures the kinds of conversations people can have. It limits the kinds of solidarity, the kinds of coalitions that people can build in being able to advocate for the kinds of human rights violations that we're seeing in this current conflict, right? Because it's automatically assumed that if you're coming from one group, you have certain views, you're this or that. So these images do something really important by bringing on the ethnic mapping and the ethnic conflict that's happening in Ethiopia into the digital space in very visible and very structuring ways. And so, yeah, so people that I've spoken to and interviewed told me about the kinds of depression, the kinds of anxiety, stress, fear, lack of sleep that they were feeling throughout these different moments of the crisis, and the kinds of depression that came from not being able to speak honestly and about these complex problems, about being able to have this cross dialogue, and how stressful and how difficult that was for them, and being able to not being able to connect with other Ethiopians from different backgrounds because of this conflict, right? So loss of friendships, loss of important social ties, anxiety in spaces, in these public spaces, right? Going to restaurants or seeing other Ethiopians in public spaces and the kinds of feelings that would elicit, right? So you don't know who is who, and the responses that you get from seeing people might not have been what it was before, right? Sorry. Yeah, and so like these media also kind of exaggerate and also spread misinformation, and and they work, and this is also a big problem with mainstream media, so news organizations that are exaggerating the conflict, exaggerating the kind of conflict that's happening, because this is a very politicized conflict. So activist groups are politicizing this conflict, and they are politicizing the kinds of violence that's taking place, and positioning groups as, again, like I said before, as the villains or perpetrators, and essentializing ethnic identities in ways that are quite scary. So you get misinformation from mainstream media, and so some of the other things that you
that's perfectly a great transition with another aspect, which is related to the use of law, specifically to try to tackle all these issues that you've just highlighted rightly. And I would like to turn to thank you so much, Azab. I would like to turn to Johannes precisely on that. The Prime Minister's government, Abiy Ahmed, who received, we have to remember, received the Nobel Peace Prize in, I think, 2018, or 19, sorry, I have a mix up there, please correct me. His government has been at the forefront on these issues of online hate speech and disinformation. A law was adopted. Can you explain what that law is and whether or not it has been efficient almost 2 years into the conflict? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, you are right. The Prime Minister, during his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, also highlighted that the impact of hate speech, as especially hate mongers are spewing hate speech through online spaces. So after that, he was, sponsoring the bill that suppress and prevent hate speech. And when the bill was tabled for public consultation, there were serious concerns by academia as well as civil society groups. I also participated in the drafting process and in the public consultation, and many members of parliamentarians were eager to have a law that punish and prevent hate speech. As I highlighted precisely, there were serious dangers of hate speech that were arising in connection with ethnicity, especially following the killing of Hachalu Hundessa. It became manifested, especially in digital context. But this law was tabled in early December 2019, and it was adopted in February 2020. And during and after the approval, there was a lofty ambition to suppress hate speech and disinformation across the country. However, the law was not effective for the following reasons. The first reason is there is, lacks as well as, poor implementation across the law enforcement, especially there is no freestanding tribunals and courts across the country that try and decide on hate speech and disinformation cases, unlike the cases of South Africa. In South Africa, for example, there are equality tribunals that try hate speech and discrimination and equality cases, but in Ethiopia, hate speech and disinformation is vested to regular courts, and the regular courts are not well equipped to try cases related to hate speech. And the second problem is related with some of the definitional challenges of the law. The law was especially tries to define hate speech as a speech that deliberately promotes hatred, attack, or violence against protected group based on ethnicity, gender, race, and disability. But while the law defines attack and discrimination, the law fails to define what amounts to hatred. So this would give rise to the subjective application of the law. However, in practice, so far only handful cases of disinformation are being litigated. The one is related with COVID pandemic issue. The other one is recently there are some radio journalists that were allegedly disseminating fake news, covering the issue that the rebels TPLF were controlling some of the cities in Amhara region, and actually their case is still being litigated. And apart from that, we don't have any cases related with, I don't see and I don't find in my research as well as across the public, there is no one has been indicted for hate speech using this hate speech and disinformation proclamation. When it comes to the problem with social media platforms, the hate speech and disinformation proclamation, especially under Article 8, draws a parallel with the Germany's law on Network Enforcement Act, and that law mandates, the Ethiopian counterpart also mandates social media platforms to take down contents within 24 hours upon receiving notification. However, social media platforms are not responsive to this kind of demands, partly because Ethiopia has no, efficient, law enforcement, unlike Germany. So, so far, the mandate to supervise this power is vested to the Ethiopian Broadcast Authority, now the Ethiopian Media Authority. And this media authority is mainly focusing on mainstream medias, not on social medias. Still, this authority is yet to make reports how these social media platforms are discharging their functions. However, there is also a problem with moderating content. And recently, even in connection with the war in Tigray, there is partisan as well as a kind of partisan sort of content moderation. Recently, the Ethiopian security, the Ethiopian Intelligence and Security Agency (INSA) accused Facebook and other social media platforms for muting voices of pan-Ethiopian and kind of pro-government pages and accounts, while promoting and supporting contents from terrorist organizations such as the OLA. Maybe Robera will highlight us later. And the other, the TPLF is also designated as a terrorist organization in May 7, 2020 by Ethiopian Parliament. So amid these kinds of accusations and counter accusations, I find that social media platforms are grappling to impartially moderate content, and partly they are relying heavily on flooding of reporters in some contexts. And also there is linguistic barriers across platforms to effectively moderate contents. And also part of the problem is these social media platforms hired handful moderators, even they don't have any breakdown of, moderators for Ethiopia. And also they don't make any comprehensive human rights impact assessment, how this content is, have entail a real life impact across Ethiopia. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Johannes. Yasha, on to the next question.
Thank you very much. It's been a very interesting conversation. I just wanted to go to Robera, and since you recently published the articles in Global Voices about dangerous organizations and individuals listed on Facebook, very much related to our first workshop we had a few weeks ago, in which the Oromo Liberation Army was added. What were the reactions and what are the implications of this addition from a human rights perspective? Robera.
Thank you very much. But for those of you who are not familiar with the Oromo Liberation Army is a militant splinter of Oromo Liberation Front, fighting the Ethiopian government. So initially it came to my attention on my Facebook feed, people talking about being censored, their account being suspended for expressing their support for Oromo Liberation Army. Some even say that they are not even allowed to mention the name of the organization. So I have, the international spokesperson of the organization on his verified Twitter account said that the group has been designated as a dangerous organization. So on October 2021, a secret blacklist of dangerous organizations of Facebook was leaked, and the OLA, or Oromo Liberation Army, is among them. So the reaction with regard to the Oromo is that this is unfair decision from Facebook, and they are undertaking Twitter campaigns and other ways, asking Facebook to reconsider its decision. So mostly the question with regard to this designation is that Facebook, being a global platform with more than 2 billion users, its rules, by rules I mean its community standards, should be transparent. I mean, these users should know upfront whether they can express their support to a particular organization or not on the platform. So there is a lack of transparency in that regard, where whether you just have to know if you are using the platform, whether you are allowed to do that or not. In addition, the other concern is from Ethiopian politics. Facebook chooses to apply its a dangerous individual and organization policy solely on Oromo Liberation Army. So there is no other armed or unarmed political actors that has been designated, which gives an implication that there are, for example, parties to the northern conflict, to the current, has been accused of serious human rights violations, which has through investigation undertaken by United Nations, different international media organizations. But it's only Facebook only chooses to apply the dangerous policy, dangerous individual and policy on OLA. So which somehow leads to the uneven application of the platform or content moderation from Facebook, which gives an implication that the Oromo Facebook users are being targeted.
Thank you very much, Robera. This context is extremely helpful and helps us, link to so many of the discussions that we want to have within the Content Policy and Society Lab, and the issue of designating groups, especially in such a complex conflict. And that's what comes out from what you've helped us what you've walked us through, each of you at the beginning of this discussion. This is a very complex conflict, and yes, there's no way only one group can make decisions and affect everyone. Nelson, I would like to rapidly get back to you before we go to the Q&A. You were starting your intervention by walking us through the big overview of what you've seen in terms of actors, networks, patterns of discourses, and let's say mis and disinformation. I was hoping maybe you could, help us understand whether some of the actors mentioned here today have been identifying the research you've done, or whether the government is involved. Can you please help us be more specific here? Thank you. And please unmute yourself. Thanks.
Hello. Yeah, I'm just sorry, like my line went off a bit. Can you just repeat to me the question a bit concise?
Yes, I was asking whether you could walk us through some of the actors that you identified through the research and content monitoring efforts that you've done in Ethiopia in the past few months and years. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for that. Basically, like in terms of our research, one of the things that we were looking at. So you have
Nelson?
Yes. Hello. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, very well. Please go ahead.
Sorry, Julie, am I audible? Yeah, sorry. So in terms of our research, so Facebook, we were kind of looking at the community standards of Facebook and how they are applied across the platform. And then we're also looking at like, what is the response time in terms of some of the content that is being flagged. And one of the two things we added in terms of our research is virality and harmfulness or likelihood to cause harm. So there is a lot of content that is most likely divisive or might cause harm, but it is not very viral. So might not like if something is just only shared by one or two individuals, it might not cause a lot of that harm. But on the other hand, we're also looking at like a content, if you look at it as two axes, we're looking at kind of like the content that is extremely viral and that also has a high likelihood of causing harm, whether that is in terms of inciting to violence and kind of doing all like inciting to violence or sharing graphic images or doing stuff like that. And we've been flagging this with Facebook using kind of Ethiopian-based fact checkers and kind of content moderators, not only flagging it to Facebook, but we were also kind of recording it down in terms of keeping Facebook accountable, in terms of their response time, in terms of their actions that they're taking, or even in terms of the appeal that people do at times in terms of, like if say that this content was not taken down, but someone can say, no, it needs to be taken down in one or two aspects. Just coming back to the actors, let me give you early on, I was talking about diluting the messages and someone was talking about actors. Let me give you one of the examples of probably like few examples on I might not mention all the actors here or the stuff like that for the research, just for the sake of moving the discussion away from that naming. But let me give you some of the examples by which these discussions are being taken away. So one of them is identity politics. Someone might share a research or stuff like that or what, but someone tell you, so you're Tigrayan. Or someone say like, your identity kind of shows already what you're going to share. So we find that this is something that really kind of drags the discussions and move it away from the substance of anything else. And that is something that happens consistently and happens like almost like in a pattern manner. One of the other ways in kind of like in terms of actors that shifted, at the start of the conflict, the Ethiopian government, so there was a lot of kind of news, especially when the humanitarian access was closed and what people were like publishing news and stuff like that. The Ethiopian government decided to create its own fact-checking platform. Now, that was something that was kind of like very interesting because I've not seen other governments do it. Or when they do it, they say this is a government platform. But the one that the Ethiopian government created almost mirrored or tried to look like an actual fact-checking, an independent fact-checking platform like by Facebook or the rest and stuff like that. And that was a very hard moment for us because we're like, oh, that is very interesting. Now, we flagged this with Facebook. We're like, hey, you have independent fact checkers on the network. If the Ethiopian government has its own fact checking platform, at least it is be very explicit to the individual who's seeing it that this is a government affiliated, website or a page. So initially it went by the name Emergency Fact Checking, but then later on the page changed its name. It's Ethiopian Current Issues Fact Check, and it got verified by Facebook. Now, I actually don't have an issue with the government having its own fact checking and what, but the idea is that there are fact checking platforms in Ethiopia, independent fact checkers and grassroots fact checkers who have been on the platform for the longest, but they didn't have the voice or the verification or the number of following that this fact checking platform got. And now it started fact checking, not only it started quote unquote fact checking, not only kind of things that are going online on social media, but it also fact check other media houses and release it, says hey, this has been fact checked and these are the facts and these are not the facts, without any other third party kind of interjecting with that. And that ties back to my discussion earlier on when I was saying that it dilutes the discussion. Whenever I was talking about kind of diluting debate and discourse, the idea is that it's not only now the debate is not about the subject. Like, for example, when someone moves to identity in politics, the debate is not about now what is the substance that being discussed. The debate is on who's discussing it. Now, when it comes to fact checking, when a government releases fact-checking platform and it kind of almost masquerades like an independent fact-checking, the debate then moves from the idea of fact-checking to the question of even what is fact-checking and who can fact-check, and should everyone have their own fact-checking platform and stuff like that. And that's one of the trends that I found. To be honest, I didn't find it in any of the other countries that were existing in a government kind of trying to mirror a fact-checking platform. But I saw it as an interesting development, and social media platforms should be very much cognizant to that. And of course, Facebook will say that we will usually have a label that this is a government website, but that label is so faded and so small that the users can barely notice it. So if you're to the untrained eye, you can easily swallow a lot of government information as fact checking or an independent fact checker. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Nelson. And that's indeed a very worrying situation. You don't know whether or not you can actually trust the fact checker. We've seen some interesting examples also in another African country, Cameroon. So there might be some interesting patterns to study over there. Thank you so much to everyone. We had one last question, but really keeping it very short because we'd like to leave at least 7 minutes for the Q&A. If you could have one lesson learned from the missed opportunities with the dealing of this conflict and its online implications specifically, what would it be? If you have just one idea in one sentence. Thank you. Let's start with, Nelson, you have the floor. Please go ahead.
Yeah. I think, for example, one of the missed opportunities is the underinvestment from the social media companies. So both Facebook, Twitter, and the rest, they really didn't think things are going to blow in this proportion. So the teams were extremely, they were underinvested in terms of the resources that were placed there. And also in terms of their readiness to understand and handle the complexity and the nuance of this. So that is a very missed opportunity. So I think social media companies, for a country that has over 100 million people, the social media companies should have really anticipated and invested a lot, as opposed to saying hey, this is our Ethiopia focus and stuff like that. So this is a very the other thing I also kind of
sorry Nelson, I really have to cut.
Stop here.
Yes, please. Roberta, what's your lesson learned on missed opportunities?
Ethiopia have a lower internet penetration, but the engagement the Facebook or other social media platforms have on the ground is not only the the statics we have as internet penetration, but this online engagements has already exerting a pressure on the ground. They are real treat to real world hard. So we don't have to assume that they are not going to be exerted on the ground. They are. We have seen a lot of problems that are that that were on digital world that have resurfaced again on the.
Azeb, shortly, please.
Well, one of the hard lessons I learned through this is the importance of kind of rethinking or challenging engagement-based ranking and identity-based, like, expressive politics on and how they fuel ethnic conflict in contexts like Ethiopia, and kind of the importance of pushing these media platforms and businesses to really actually protect users and protect civilians. So I think there is actually, I'm not sure if that's a missed opportunity, but I think Ethiopia offers a really important case study for violence and how violence can be perpetuated in these online spaces, and how violence and how these platforms don't protect people, especially people from the developing or underdeveloped world contexts. So I think this is a really important opportunity to think about moderation and protecting these spaces, especially when hate speech happens in many different languages. So the inequalities that are inherent in these digital spaces.
Thank you. Johannes, your thought, please.
Thank you. Basically, the most important lesson that we shall learn from social media engagement in Ethiopia is that there should be a sort of, impartial content moderation. Especially, there are accusations and allegations against social media platforms in recent conversations in Ethiopia that they are, targeting and muting some contents while they are promoting other contents. So they are policing on for example, pro-government and pan-Ethiopian contents. So there should be, a human rights impact assessment by these media platforms, especially while the US government pressure Facebook and other social media platforms. They are now, in a way, while they are in a way addressing some of the challenges, at the same time, they are targeting, in a sense of a kind of command from the US government or the State Department. It seems to me like there is a kind of partiality toward this, moderating content. So that should be addressed more urgently. Otherwise, the Ethiopian government is even, saying that we will develop our own alternative social media platform, inspired by Russia or China or, Belt and Road Initiative. So this is my last point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johannes, and thanks all. I'll ask 3 questions, and please pick one you would like to answer in 1 minute. So the first question is, could speakers address the distinctions between country-based social media producers, users, and diaspora-based producers and users in terms of type, whether it's disinfo, hate speech, and the impact on the conflict? Azeb, I think you might want to answer that. And then there's a question related to Twitter temporarily disabling trends in Ethiopia in an effort to reduce the spread of misinformation. What are your views on this action? Please, someone. And then last but not least question, would like to know speakers' opinion on the localized impact of end-to-end encryption and any practical alternatives to internet shutdowns, and what tools the authorities could use to better manage public dialogue during ethnic conflict. Thank you. Up to you.
Will, in regards to Will's question, I hope one of y'all other panelists also responds to this, because not a lot of people in Ethiopia don't have access to digital media or the internet. So a lot of the debates are being pushed by, a lot of the conversations and debates are being pushed by the diaspora and diaspora activists, influencers, or people that are seeking to be influencers and kind of gain followers or money or something out of this conflict. So a lot of the people engaging in these debates are diaspora based, though I have seen a lot of locals also take part on Facebook conversations, but again, that's not a space that I'm observing. I have seen a lot more people that are Ethiopia based also engaging on Twitter, but on Instagram, it's mostly diaspora. And I think on Twitter too, it's also mostly diaspora or people that are like living in Addis Ababa and have access to digital media and also have enough discretionary income to be able to pay for the data. So I think it's not everybody's represented, and I think this is why ethnic conflict is being fueled in these spaces, is because or that the conflict or the issues on the ground are being exaggerated in these spaces, is because, again, it's not really actually representative of what people on the ground in Ethiopia think. And I think that's something important. And I think that's been something that's shocking to a lot of us in the diaspora, is like, whoa, we didn't think it was this bad. This is not our experience in terms of how people relate to each other, interact on the ground in Ethiopia. So yeah, so thinking about the relationships between the digital world and then the real world is really important.
Thank you so much, Azeb. Anyone for the second question related to Twitter's suspension of the trend?
I would like to jump on that, Nelson, here. I think Twitter just needs to really do things that matter. I know I've seen these and people were like all on Twitter, like, yeah, Facebook, look at what is a responsible company is doing. Disabling trend, that is just like really putting a feature down. Twitter has 5,500 employees globally. The question that they should be asking, and I think Jack has said this before, that they have numbers that they can just scale up to 10,000 users, to 10,000 staff when they want to tackle something. I think Twitter really need to invest, need to put kind of like humans into this, people who understand the nuance and the different issues that are happening in Ethiopia, so that to create a healthier discussion, as opposed to just saying that we just disabled one feature to help addressing misinformation and stuff like that. How does it address it? What are the quantified number prior to that and after? I really think it's something that is easier to do, low-hanging fruit, and mostly for the media. And yeah, Twitter needs to hire more Africans to deal with this stuff.
Thank you, Nelson. And last question related to end-to-end encryption and the impact and internet shutdowns. Anyone want to take that over?
Yeah, maybe with regard to privacy and end-to-end encryptions, it's more of less concern for Ethiopians, I think. For example, the WhatsApp has been providing the end-to-end encryption for a long time, but the popular messaging app in Ethiopia is still Telegram, who is not even, I think, not moderating and contents in Ethiopia. So privacy, end-to-end encryption are less of concern in Ethiopia, I think.
Thank you. Johannes, you wanted to jump in rapidly?
Yes, regarding circumvention tools, during internet shutdown, there are some VPNs that are popular across the country. So especially digital activists use that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a very informative session. I've learned a lot. We will stop here and thank our speakers once again for their very insightful reports and work, and thank them as well for the important work they're doing. We at the CP Content Policy and Society Lab would like to thank you, participants, for your time this morning, and also thank the staff at the Cyber Policy Center, the Philanthropy and Civil Society Center, and CPSL, of course, at Stanford University. And we will have another public briefing available soon, this time focusing on content and innovation. So please stay tuned, and thanks again for your time this morning.